participants, and to our respected speaker, Dr. M.L. Ghatne, and my fellow colleague. For the participant, I would like to highlight that during this pandemic period, due to lockdown, though we could not meet many of the participants personally, but still we feel that we have to bring the best academic knowledge and practical knowledge available in the industry to your doorstep, or you can say in your computer, so that you can view that and you can enrich your knowledge, and that will be helpful for your day-to-day practice. About this speaker, Dr. Muklesh Lakshman Ghatne is a former registrar of Maharashtra Animal and Fisheries Science University. He is a retired professor and university head for the Department of Veterinary Parasitology, Bombay Veterinary College. He is a distinguished academician, outstanding researcher, and extension worker known for his skills nationally and internationally for 27 years. Dr. Mukesh Ghatne, born on 29th August 1962, and he did his graduation, post-graduation and PhD from Bombay Veterinary College, Mumbai, which belongs to Konkan Krishi Vidyapith, Daboli, District Ratnagiri. He started his career as a research assistant in the Department of Veterinary Parasitology, Bombay Veterinary College in the year of 1987. And because of his interest for his teaching and research work, he joined as an assistant professor in Bombay Veterinary College in the year of 1990. Then he got promoted as an associate professor in the year 1997. And his subject knowledge, leadership qualities, his administrative abilities has resulted into further promotion for the post of professor of veterinary parasitology at Bombay Veterinary College, Mumbai in the year of 2008. Dr. Ghatne was actively engaged in teaching and research work and extension activities with sincerity and devotion for 27 years. He voluntarily retired on 16th November 2017. He has got a lot of recognition internationally and nationally. He worked on the panel of PhD student of University of Queensland, Australia. He is a member of Indian representative of Asia Pacific Forum on Canine Vector-borne Diseases for 6 years. He is a founder member of Tropical Council for Companion Animal Parasitology, TROCAP, headquartered in Australia. His internationally collaborative projects, he has completed 3 such projects in collaboration with Australia and Germany. His academic contributions is a big list. He has taught 31 batches of UG student, guided 17 MSc students and 1 PhD student. He was a chairman for Board of Studies, Veterinary Parasitology, Maharashtra Animal and Fisheries Science University, Nagpur. He is a paper setter, evaluator of UG, PG and PhD degree programs of several universities in India. He is an external examiner for master's and doctoral PhD thesis. He got Best Teacher Award for 3 times. He played a pivotal role in starting PhD by course called Coursework in Veterinary Parasitology in Maharashtra. His research experience spanning 30 years of his life in veterinary parasitology in companion animals and ruminants. Actually, doctor has established a molecular parasitology lab in Bombay Veterinary College, discovered a new species of wild carnivore hookworm called Golanchus ramohani. He has conducted 11 industry-sponsored projects and 2 ICAR sponsored projects. His research interests and areas of veterinary parasitology, he has published 65 research papers in the leading journals of national and international repute. He authored 3 chapters of textbook of veterinary parasitology and authored 2 ICAR scientific book. Also presented lead paper in international conferences, 3 such international conferences, and national conferences, 8 such papers, and medical conferences, 3 such papers. and also 72 contributory papers in all such conferences. Dr. Ghatne was two-time organizing secretary for national level conferences, that is National Congress of Veterinary Parasitology in 2011, and Wild Body Program and use of simulation model in veterinary education in 2013. So he has done a lot of extension work. He has participated several television programs and radio programs, 39 radio programs and 5 television programs to be specific. And he has lectured training program for the participating veterinarians, 16 such occasions, and for pharma companies, 24 such occasions, and for the field camps, he has done six such field camps. He is an excellent teacher and excellent sports person. It's actually extracurricular activity. And apart from his excellent teaching abilities, he is a good sports person, played cricket, football, table tennis at college and university level. He was a captain of veterinary cricket team of India that participated in Veterinary World Cup in South Africa in 2003. It's a news to me for many of the field veterinarians today, and acted as a team manager, selector of college and university team of cricket, football and table tennis. His professional contributions: he was invited as an expert in veterinary parasitology for recruitment of academic staff by number of universities. He has been invited as a paper setter, interview panelist by ASRB New Delhi. Small animal practitioner for last 30 years. He is an executive member of Federation of Small Animal Practitioners Association of India. He was vice president of Association of Advancement of Veterinary Parasitology. He is a member of editorial board of Journal of Veterinary Parasitology. Worked as an editor of PPIM Bulletin for 3 years, and he also worked as an assistant editor of Journal of Bombay Veterinary College Alumni Association for 3 years. So we are all very fortunate to have such a wonderful personality, a multi-talented person to enlighten our knowledge and then guide us today's program. Sir, thank you very much. Over to Dr. M.L. Ghatne.
Thank you very much for the flattering words, Mr. Karunanidhi. It was, it made me nostalgic, going through all those, events and whatever achievements you can call. So good evening, participants. And at the outset, I would like to thank the organizers, Animal Health Division of Alembic, and particularly Mr. P. Karunanidhi, Senior Vice President, then Mr. Rajesh Kumar Sharma, Dr. Santosh Shinde, Dr. Sanjay Latkar, Dr. Amit Singh, so entire team, Dr. Naresh Kulkarni and Dr. Gangadhar Thomre, for giving me this opportunity to be with you all. It is always a pleasure for me to interact with the field veterinarians. And today also, I am excited to be with you all. Today I will be speaking on the management of hemoprotozoan diseases of large ruminants in India. But before I begin my presentation, let me confess honestly that my clinical experience or a field experience pertaining to large animal is not that great. It is very limited. Though I did a large animal practice at the beginning of my career way back in 1985 to 1990 in Mumbai, but the things have changed a lot during last 2 or 3 decades. And this was the reason when Dr. Latkar called me coming up with this particular offer, I was in a dilemma whether to accept the assignment or not. But on second thought, I felt, why not? I have got a little bit knowledge, theoretical knowledge on these hemoprotozoan diseases, being academician for more than 3 decades. And you guys are dealing with these cases on a regular basis, so you have a practical experience of these infections. And then I thought it will be a good blend of theory as well as practical. It may happen that some of the points in my presentation provide you justification or a reason for the observations you are confronting with in your clinical practice. I will also get to know about the field conditions, field problems when we have a discussion after the presentation. So it will be enriching experience for all of us. It will be win-win situation for all of us. With that, let me begin with my presentation, that is management of hemoprotozoan diseases of a large ruminant. Let me begin with the facts and figures. The livestock sector in India has shown a steady growth over past few years. And today we are contributing 4.11% to the national GDP, 25.6% of which constitutes the GDP coming from the agriculture sector. It is not at all very surprising or shocking because we have got a huge livestock population to the tune of 510 million as per the latest census. And around 60% of that population belong to cattle and buffalo categories or large ruminants. There are 300 million cattle and buffaloes in India. So it will not be exaggeration that cattle and buffaloes are contributing substantially to the livestock economics in India. What are the products? There are three main products: milk production, meat production, and leather production. The annual milk production is to the tune of 187 million metric tons per year, that is annual. And we are number one in the world as far as milk production is concerned. If you consider meat production, the annual production is 5.3 million tons, and 62% of the meat is coming from large animals, that is cattle and buffaloes. And as far as buffalo meat is concerned, we are world number one. In goats, we are world number two. Then leather production also is contributing substantially to the livestock industry in India. And I was also surprised to see these figures. Last year, we produced around 3 billion square feet of leather. And if you look at the world scenario, we are in top 4 to 5 nations as far as the leather production is concerned. So livestock sector, up till now what I have done, I have painted a very rosy picture about the livestock sector, but there is a darker shade to this, and that is the per capita production, that is per head production of our livestock or our animals is less than optimum or is not that great or it is not up to the mark. And this is the reason when our Honorable Prime Minister, when he announced the ambitious scheme of doubling farmers' income by year 2022-23, when we will be celebrating our Diamond Jubilee of independence, major thrust was given to the livestock sector. If you look at the budget of 2018, 2019, and even 2020, just before the COVID, huge provisions have been made to strengthen the livestock sector. Now, why livestock sector? What is so special about livestock sector? There are many reasons, but I feel 3-4 reasons are very important. Number one is livestock sector is less dependent on the weather conditions, or I can put it other way, that livestock sector has a better sustainability in adverse climatic conditions. Number two, the livestock production can be integrated with different agro businesses or rural businesses. And the third, as I've already mentioned, that the per capita production is less and there is a huge scope for improvement.
Sorry to disturb you, sir. Presentation needs to be made in presentation form.
Okay, I have to.
Yes. Slide. Sorry, sir. Sorry to disturb.
No, it's okay. Now it's okay?
Yes, sir. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I was on this particular slide. Now, why the per capita production is not up to the mark? There are a number of factors. Of course, each one of this is a different webinar topic. The genetic makeup of our animal, then nutrition, reproduction, infectious and metabolic diseases. And in infectious and metabolic diseases, there are bacterial infections, viral infections, and parasitic infections. Out of which parasitic infections are very important, not because I am a parasitologist and I am delivering this particular webinar today, but because the prevalence of different types of parasites are, is ubiquitous in different parts of India. and they are associated with substantial economic losses even in subclinical and in latent forms. These parasitic infections have a multifaceted effects. Even the parasites, when the animals are having parasitic infestation, they cause immunosuppression, and such individuals can pick up any other infections more frequently as compared to those animals which are not harboring parasites. The parasites also cause malnourishment, so the nutrients are in short supply, and that is reflected in production. And the parasites also have adverse impact on the reproduction. So multifaceted effects are seen by the parasitic diseases. There are different types of parasites occurring in these animals in different regions. But in my opinion, two groups are very important. One is a vector and vector-borne infections, and second is gastrointestinal helminthosis, out of which I am going to talk on vector and vector-borne infections. Now, there are 4 to 5 important infections occurring ubiquitously in India: trypanosomosis, theileriosis, babesiosis. These are hemoprotozoan infections. And then in addition to that, anaplasmosis and ehrlichiosis. Anaplasma and Ehrlichia are now classified as bacteria. Now, because of the time constraint, I will be talking more on trypanosomosis, theileriosis, and babesiosis, and I'll be giving passing references as far as anaplasmosis and ehrlichiosis are concerned. Let me come to trypanosomosis. Trypanosomosis in India is caused by Trypanosoma ivansae, and this particular species is distributed throughout India, associated with substantial economic losses. There is one more species that has been reported in India, and that is Trypanosoma theileri, but this particular species is practically non-pathogenic. Its importance lies in the fact that it must be differentiated from Trypanosoma ivansae. But in the field conditions, it is mostly Trypanosoma ivansae, because Trypanosoma theileri are sporadically reported from different parts of India. Trypanosomes are transmitted by blood-sucking flies like Tabanus, Thermoxys, and Hematobia. Then theileriosis is caused by mainly Theileria annulata throughout India, and there are few reports of Theileria orientalis. Theileriosis is transmitted by ticks, basically Hyaloma species of ticks, which are widely prevalent in different parts of India. Then babesiosis is caused by Babesia bigemina, which is a large pyroplasm, and Babesia bovis, which is a small pyroplasm. Under field conditions, or when you peep inside the microscope, you can easily make out whether it is a large or a small pyroplasm. If the length of the organism is more than the radius of the RBCs in which they are present, then it is considered as a large pyroplasm. If it is less than that, then it is considered as small pyroplasm. But the literature, Indian literature, suggests that Babesia bigemina is widely prevalent in different parts of India. It is transmitted by Rhipicephalus microplus, the new name for Boophilus microplus. The taxonomist, they don't have any other agenda, and that is how, you will see, a lot of changes in the taxonomy. So Boophilus microplus is now identified or known as Rhipicephalus microplus. Anaplasmosis is caused by Anaplasma marginale, and there are different types of ticks and flies involved in the transmission of anaplasmosis. If you see the literature, around 20 species of arthropods, ticks and flies, are involved in the transmission of anaplasmosis. So these infections are associated with the pathogenic effects, and they are associated with substantial economic losses. Now, I recollect when I joined veterinary profession as an undergraduate student, and when we were attending the lectures at Bombay Veterinary College in way back 1980 or 82, then we were told in the first year itself that White Revolution program was launched somewhere in 1972 or 73. And under this White Revolution program, crossbreeding was recommended on a large scale. And there were few major hindrances to the success of this crossbreeding program. And one of these were hemoprotozoan infections like theileriosis, babesiosis, and trypanosomosis. And see the irony, now even after 50 years, we are dealing with the same infections. Of course, no doubt, the magnitude of the economic losses at that time was much higher than the economic losses today, thanks to our field veterinarians who are doing commendable job in spite of all odd situation. Because as you all know, that around 80 to 90% of our livestock come under unorganized sector, and it is really very difficult, challenging for the field veterinarians to tackle such cases because of this fact. So, coming to the economic losses, unfortunately, there are no direct references available in the literature which highlight the economic losses associated with these infections. But there are a number of indirect references where the economic losses are calculated by considering different parameters, and these are expressed as projected economic losses. So in the next 3 plates, I am going to emphasize the projected economic losses caused by the vectors first, and then vector-borne diseases. So coming to the projected economic losses caused by the vectors, if you see in this table on your screen, flies and different types of flies, biting flies and even non-biting flies like Musca are associated with huge economic losses. And in case of crossbred cows, the loss is to the tune of 50 rupees per cow per day. In case of indigenous animals, it is around 17 rupees per cow per day. In buffaloes, 35 rupees per buffalo per day. If you see ticks, in case of crossbred, it is 61 rupees per cow per day. And in case of indigenous animals or cows, it is 20 rupees per cow per day. Ticks, are not frequently found on the body of the buffaloes, so you don't find the data of the buffaloes here. Now let me talk about the projected economic losses caused due to trypanosomosis in buffaloes. Of course, these are references maybe 4 to 5 years back. But as you can see here, the economic losses associated with the infection, trypanosoma infection in buffaloes in terms of milk yield, and in 4 different states, as you can see here. And in the last column, you will see the figure, that is the loss in Indian rupees per animal per year. So that is quite huge, as you can appreciate from the last column. Similarly, the projected economic losses due to theileriosis in crossbred cattle from 5 different states, Gujarat, Karnataka, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Uttarakhand. And you will find again in the last column the magnitude of the economic losses in terms of rupees is very great. So these infections, whether they are in clinical form or a subclinical forms, are associated with the economic losses. Now, here onwards, I'm going to deal this presentation with the clinician's perspective, because as I've said, we are dealing in unorganized sector. 80 to 90% of our animals are in the unorganized sector. There are farmers having 8, 9, 10, 15 animals, and the field veterinarians are dealing these cases on a regular basis. So when you set up a clinical radar to identify these infections, you will come across the symptoms like there is a lethargy, anorexia, then there is a sudden drop in production, there may be fever or pyrexia, the temperature may go as high as 104 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit, suspended rumination, pale mucous membrane, sometimes the mucous membrane may be icteric, then there is an edema of the dependent parts of the body. So all these symptoms are indicated by most of the hemoprodroson infections. But when you come across such cases, the natural or the usual tendency is to start with antibiotic and antipyretic. But these cases do not respond to antibiotic therapy. I am fully aware that oxytetracycline, which is the most preferred antibiotic under field condition, has efficacy against anaplasmosis as well as theileriosis. But the dose rate at which it acts on anaplasmosis and theileriosis is much higher than the antibiotic dose rate. As we all know, the antibiotic dose rate is around 2.5 to 5 milligrams per kg body weight, while in order to have actions against anaplasmosis and theileriosis, the dose rate is much higher, to the tune of 10 milligrams or even higher than that. So in short, these cases do not respond to the antibiotic therapy, and then the element of doubt is created in the minds of clinicians that it could be one of the hemoprodroson infections. So these are some of the initial symptoms, or I can call it as a presenting signs. In addition to that, there are certain other additional symptoms, or which you can call it as a secondary symptoms or the derivatives of the pathophysiological process that is taking place in the body of the infected animals. So this table depicts different sets of symptoms. There, as you can see in the first column, respiratory symptoms, then digestive symptoms, ophthalmic symptoms, then there are nervous symptoms, or even skin lesions are seen. Now, if you look at this particular table, or even if you put a glance to this particular table, you will find most of the symptoms are overlapping. So on the basis of symptoms, you cannot make a species-specific diagnosis. And prima facie, it may appear that these symptoms are of no use as far as the identification of the hemoprotozoan infection is concerned. When I'm saying hemoprotozoan infection, those three infections, and I'm also including anaplasma and ehrlichiosis, though we know for the fact that these are bacterial infections. The point I would like to emphasize here, yes, these symptoms are overlapping, but there are three important points here. Number one, certain set of symptoms occur more frequently. The probability is more with one particular infection as compared to other hemoprotozoan infection. Number two, these certain symptoms may appear during the early phase of infection or early stage of infection as compared to other hemoprotozoan infections where they appear during the later phase of infection. And number three, although the symptoms are same, the pathophysiology responsible for those symptoms may be different in different species of hemoprotozoan parasites or different vector-borne diseases. Of course, I'm not going to explain one by one, but let me elaborate my point by one or two examples. Say respiratory symptoms are seen in SARA, in theileriosis, and also in anaplasmosis. I did not get references about babesiosis, but in these three infections. Now, respiratory symptoms are more frequently seen in theileriosis, and those symptoms appear during early phase of infection, during first 3 weeks of the infection. While in case of SARA, in case of anaplasmosis, respiratory symptoms appear less frequently and during the later phase of infection. Likewise, you will also see diarrhea more frequently seen in case of theileriosis as compared to other hemoprotozoan infection. And one more thing I would like to emphasize here is that urticarial skin lesions, which is printed in blue, where this is my personal experience. I did not get any references in the literature, but when I was in service, we used to work in the laboratory. We used to receive samples for the parasitological investigations. And one of my colleagues who used to work in Buffalo Shades, he used to get blood samples for the parasitological investigation. And invariably, while handing over the blood sample, he used to predict that, sir, this sample will be positive for trypanosomosis. In the initial phase, I did not pay much attention to what he was saying, but later on I realized that his prediction is almost 70 to 80% correct. And then when I inquired that how come, you predict so accurately, then he said, in these buffaloes, there are urticarial lesions on the skin. In buffaloes, as you all know, this is your daily observation, that the hair are removed and the skin lesions are evident. So these urticarial lesions are seen in buffaloes, and such buffaloes are invariably positive for Trypanosoma evans infection. So this is a great observation by a field veterinarian. And this is, this is a little deviation from the topic. I would like to appeal to all the field veterinarians that they should publish, if they come across any unusual observation, any unusual case, or even, they should compile their data, annual data, and publish it. Because, that forms the basis for the academicians and the researchers to work on it. I know you don't derive any benefits out of publication, but that is how the epidemiological data or epidemiological scene can be constructed, which will be very, very handy for your fellow veterinarians. The nervous signs are commonly seen in trypanosomosis as compared to babesiosis. of late, I was under impression that in theileriosis, nervous signs are not seen. But there are quite a few references in the last 4 to 5 years where the nervous signs are also affiliated to theileriosis. So in this particular table, 3 points which I mentioned, one is the frequency of occurrence of these symptoms, then the phase or the timing when these symptoms appear, and pathophysiology I'm going to discuss later on. So on a field conditions, how are you going to identify these cases? Trypanosomosis, in addition to those symptoms which are specified on the clinical radar, you will also see nervous signs, particularly in buffaloes, like circling, stamping of feet, excessive bellowing, excessive salivation, excessive lacrimation, then in muscle twitching, shivering, head pressing. All these symptoms are seen. And then in buffaloes, as I've said, that erythematous skin lesions. I don't know. This is a story of about 9 to 10 years back. I don't know whether the same feature you people are observing in the SARA cases in buffaloes. Theileriosis can be identified on the basis of swelling of lymph nodes, prescapular lymph node, prefemoral lymph node, supramammary lymph node, then submandibular lymph node, parotid lymph node. So swelling of lymph node. And then you will also find during early phase of infection, there is a respiratory distress in the form of dyspnea, nasal discharge, shallow breathing, intermittent coughing. The diarrhea cases are also seen in diarrhea may also be seen in theileriosis. Now, diarrhea can be caused by a number of reasons, but when it is clubbed with respiratory distress, when it is clubbed with swelling of lymph node, it is one of the prominent signs of theileriosis. Coming to babesiosis, babesiosis can be identified by hemoglobinuria or hemoglobinemia. When you collect the blood sample in the anticoagulant, you will find plasma is little reddish in color, particularly in Babesia bigemina. The nervous signs are associated with Babesia bovis, which are reported sporadically in different parts of India. Babesia bovis is also associated with hypotensive shock. Of course, pathophysiology I'm going to discuss later on in the presentation. Now let us talk about the susceptibility of these animals, breed-wise susceptibility and age-wise susceptibility. Now, irrespective of the breed, babesiosis and anaplasmosis, they exhibit a reverse age resistance. The animals before 9 months of age are less susceptible to babesiosis, and animals before 16 months of age are less susceptible to anaplasmosis. But overall, crossbred and purebred animals are very susceptible to these infections. The mortality rate and morbidity rate are higher. So care has to be taken when the new animal is introduced in the endemic area, for which you should know what are the endemic areas, or your area is endemic for which infections, and there epidemiological data plays a very important role. Then buffaloes, the most common infection in buffaloes is trypanosomosis, that is SARA. In all age groups you will find. Then buffalo cows may have a theileriosis. In adults, they are refractory to theileriosis, and there is a very low prevalence of babesiosis in buffaloes. Comparatively, indigenous animals are better placed. They are resistant, or I would say resilient. That means they are infected, but they can perform in the infection also. So they are resilient to theileriosis, but they are susceptible to babesiosis and trypanosomosis. But overall, these indigenous animals, they are less susceptible to these hemoprotozoan infections, particularly in comparison with the crossbred animals. Now, let me talk about the pathophysiology, and before that, I will be talking a little bit on the life cycle. Don't worry, I am not going to bother you with the complex life cycle, but I'll be telling you the salient features of the development of the parasite in the body of the animal, which is relevant with the pathophysiology of the particular disease. Because once you understand the pathophysiology, then it will be easy for you to correlate the symptoms with the episode that is taking place in the body of the infected animals. So trypanosomes are present in the plasma of the infected animals, and they are mechanically transmitted by hematophagous flies like Tabanus, Stomoxys, and other hematophagous flies. and there is neither development nor multiplication of the trypanosomes in the body of the vectors. You'll be surprised to know that these organisms can survive in the mouth parts of these flies for not more than 25 to 30 minutes. So if the infection has to occur, it has to occur in 25 to 30 minutes. Otherwise, the organisms die. But the habits of these flies are such that facilitate the transmission, mechanical transmission of these organisms. They have an interrupted feeding habits. That means in order to become replete or in order to have a complete blood meal, they keep biting the host at several places and several hosts at a time. You know, tabanas species of flies, they attack the animals which are grazing on the pasture, and when they are grazing very close to each other, then these flies have a habit of changing their or shuffling between the host, and that is how the infection is transmitted. Once the infection is transmitted, then the organisms enter into the blood, and in the plasma they multiply by binary fission. So it is a asexual reproduction from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, and that is how it goes on. In case of cattle and buffaloes, the rate of multiplication is much slower than horses and dogs, which are the most susceptible hosts for Trypanosoma vivans. Now let me talk about the pathophysiology. There are three important observations associated with this particular infection. One is drop in milk, and there are cases of ketosis. Then nervous signs are exhibited by the infected animals, and you will also come across anemia, that is a pale mucous membrane. So why there is a drop in milk or why there is a ketosis? As you all know that the organisms are present in the blood, and for their activity and for their reproduction, they utilize the blood glucose. So there is a rapid utilization of the blood glucose that leads to hypoglycemia, and as a result of which there is a drop in milk yield. The trypanosomes are also known to excrete certain endotoxins, and these endotoxins have an adverse effect on different systems, different organs, and liver is one of these organs. And as you all know, liver is the principal site for gluconeogenesis. So because of the action of the endotoxins, the liver functions are impaired, and as a result of which gluconeogenesis is hampered, and unfinished products are thrown into the blood circulation, may also appear in the urine or even milk, and that is how it is known as ketosis of the ketone bodies. Acetic acid and butyric acids enter into the circulation. So here the ketosis is secondary to trypanosoma infection. As you all know that ketosis happens generally in the first 2 or 3 months of lactation. Then coming to nervous signs. Now why there are nervous signs? The pinpoint explanation is not available in the literature, but there are several theories which have been put forth in the literature, and one big theory is that the nervous signs are mainly because of hypoglycemia. As you all know, when there is a hypoglycemia, nervous signs are exhibited, or the signs are somewhat like nervous signs. Even in human beings, diabetic persons, when there is a hypoglycemia, the signs are exhibited. So that could be the reasons for nervous signs. Then trypanosoma, they are present not only in the blood or in the plasma, they are also present in all types of body fluids, in the cerebrospinal fluid as well as in the aqueous humor. And in the cerebrospinal fluid, they are responsible for changing the concentration of different ingredients of the cerebrospinal fluid. As you all know, the biochemical composition or the ingredients are same as plasma, but their concentrations are different. So there is a change in the concentration, and that could be the reason for the nervous signs. Then trypanosoma are also present in aqueous humor, and that is why you will see ophthalmic lesions, particularly corneal opacity, lacrimation, so on and so forth. Then anemia. Now why there is anemia? These are not intracellular parasites, they are present in the plasma. Okay, so how come there is anemia? The main reason for anemia is the adsorption, that is coating of trypanosoma antigens on the surface of erythrocytes. And then these erythrocytes are not identified as a self-protein, but those are identified as a foreign material, and then they are vulnerable for erythrophagocytosis. And these RBCs are destroyed on a large scale in the spleen, or you can call it as a sequestration in the spleen. So that is why there is anemia. The anemia may also be in, say, less than 10% cases because of the endotoxins that are released by the trypanosomes, and these endotoxins have adverse impact on the bone marrow where the erythropoiesis takes place. So there is a dyserythropoiesis. Of course, by analyzing the anemia, you can easily make out whether the first is that is absorption of antigen is the reason, or dyserythropoiesis is the reason. Generally, in the first case, you will find the anemia is normochromic normocytic type. All the erythrocytic indices are well within the normal reference range. And the anemia is a regenerative anemia. So there are reticulocytes in the circulation. While if the anemia is non-regenerative, then this erythropoiesis is the reason. So that is how you can make out. So that is a pathophysiology of trypanosoma infections in cattle and buffaloes. Let me come to the life cycle and pathophysiology of theileriosis. As we all know, theileriosis is also rampant in different parts of India, and it is transmitted by Hyloma species of ticks. Now, these Hyloma species of ticks, they are involved in the transmission, and the infections which are picked up by the larval and nymphal stages from the infected animals during hematophagous activity are transmitted during nymphal and adult stages respectively when they are feeding on the clean host. And this kind of transmission is known as a transstadial transmission or stage-to-stage transmission. That means one stage picks up the infection and the other stage transmits the infection. So these ticks acquire the infection when they are feeding on the infected host by consuming the blood, and particularly the pyroplasm stages which are present in the RBCs. And then there is a sexual reproduction in the body of the ticks, and sporozoites appear in the salivary glands. And these sporozoites are then injected into the body of the new host when the next stage is feeding on that particular host. Now, when sporozoites are injected into the body of the host, these are initially trapped by the macrophages in order to destroy them. So that is a natural immune response. But the biochemical system of these Theileria parasites or sporozoites is so advanced that they overcome the immune response or the immunity of the host. And when these organisms are taken to the regional lymph node, they in fact invade the immune cells of the body, that is lymphocytes. And in the cytoplasm of the lymphocytes, they start multiplying asexually by way of schizogony. The parent cell which is undergoing the process of schizogony is known as schizons, and such schizons appear in the cytoplasm of the lymphocytes. And these are referred as Koch-Blue bodies. Now, one more very important aspect is that these Koch-Blue bodies release different types of biochemicals, endotoxins or cytokines. And one of the cytokines is responsible for even the proliferation of the host cell also. So there is a synchronized proliferation of the parasite as well as host cell. So along with the multiplication of the parasite in the cytoplasm, there is also proliferation of the host cell, and that is how the number of lymphocytes, or these are basically immature lymphocytes, those are lymphoblasts, increase in the circulation. And after certain generations of sexual reproduction, the parasitic stages eventually enter into the RBCs, and then the pyriform stages are formed, as you can see in the third picture, where a small pyroplasm or pyriform ring-like structure is formed, hardly 1 micron or 1.5 microns in diameter or length. There is a big vacuole and a signet ring-like appearance. And that is how the life cycle is completed. Now, if you look at these cases or in your clinical experience, you must have come across three important set of observations. One is a lymphadenopathy, second is a respiratory distress and diarrhea, and third is anemia. Now, lymphadenopathy, partly I have already explained why there is a lymphadenopathy, because these sporozoites, when they enter into the lymphocytes, they multiply in the cytoplasm, and those cytokines also trigger the multiplication or division of the infected lymphocytes, and that is how the lymphocyte count also goes on increasing. So there is a proliferation of the lymphoid tissues, lymphoblasts, and then after certain generations, there is exhaustion of the lymphoid tissues, and then the lymphocyte count also gradually comes down. So there is a proliferation in the initial stage, and then later on it becomes, there is an exhaustion of the lymphoid tissues. Now this proliferation starts around say 5 to 7 days after the infection. Coming to respiratory distress, as I've said, the pathophysiology for theileriosis is different. Pathophysiology for respiratory distress and trypanosomosis and anaplasmosis is different. In case of theileriosis, the main pathophysiology responsible for respiratory distress is the lymphocytic vesiculitis, that is inflammation of blood vessels or even lymphatic vessels. And there is lymphocytic infiltration in the wall of the vessels, tunica intima, tunica media, tunica adventitia. So in the wall, there is a lymphocytic infiltration. And as we all know, in the lungs, there is an extensive network of the pulmonary vessels, and there is a pulmonary lymphocytic vesiculitis. And then there is a pulmonary edema, there is a lymphocytic infiltration in the edema, and these events are actually responsible for the respiratory symptoms like nasal discharge, then shallow respiratory breathing, intermittent coughing, so on and so forth. Then why there is a diarrhea? As I've said, that the Koch-Flu bodies or the Sisons are involved in the release of different types of biochemicals, and some of these biochemicals have adverse impact on different systems of the body, including the digestive system. So in fact, these endotoxins are involved in the multisystemic disorders, and that is how the endotoxins are responsible for causing punched out ulcers in the abomasal mucosa. Even the mesenteric lymph nodes are also swollen, and these events are responsible for diarrhea, which occur during the early phase of infection, that means within the first 2 to 3 weeks. Why there is anemia? Now here, the pyroplasms or the pyriform organisms which are present in the RBCs are responsible for this particular effect. The mechanism is more or less same as I have mentioned for trypanosoma, absorption of the antigen-antibody complexes on the surface of the RBCs, and then there is a erythrophagocytosis in the spleen and large-scale destruction of the RBCs, and that is how anemia is caused. Then one more reason which has been quoted in the literature is the oxidative stress. In these infections, there is a release of free oxygen radicals which are detrimental for that particular cells or RBCs in general. The RBCs become fragile, and such RBCs are then vulnerable for destruction on a large scale, and that leads to anemia. And then the third reason, which is in less than 10% or 5% cases, and that is this erythrobiosis because of the adverse impact of these endotoxins in the bone marrow. Coming to babesiosis, the babesiosis, I'm talking about Babesia bigemini infection, which is widely prevalent, and it is transmitted by Rhipicephalus microplus. And this is trans-ovarian transmission. In theileria, we have seen it is a stage-to-stage transmission, but in babesiosis, there is a trans-ovarian transmission. The reason being that these ticks are one host tick. So larvae, nymphal stages, and adults of the ticks are present on the body of the same individual. So the only mode of transmission is trans-ovarian transmission. So these organisms which are multiplying in the RBCs are picked up during the hematophagous activity by the ticks, larval stages or nymphal stages or adults, particularly the females. And then the organisms appear in the eggs of the female ticks, and then the larval and nymphal stages of the next generations are involved in the transmission. And once the organisms are injected into the body of the host, there is only one site of predilection, and that is RBCs, in which they undergo multiplication by asexual reproduction. These are pyriform organisms. They are present in pairs and they multiply asexually by way of binary fission. Now, if you look at the pathophysiology, the principal feature of babesiosis is severe anemia and long-lasting anemia, because there is a large-scale destruction of the RBCs. The first two reasons are same, which I have quoted for thalaeriosis, that is absorption of the antigen and oxidative stress, so I need not repeat it again. The third reason, which is invariably seen with Babesia bovis rather than Babesia bigemina, and that is release of certain pharmacologically active substances. And as a result of this, there is vasodilatation of the blood vessels, so the permeability increases, the fluid part goes out, and that appears like a edema of the dependent portions of the body. And then there is a hypovolemic shock. So the volume is not maintained in the vascular system, resulting into hypovolemic shock. There are a few reports about intravascular coagulopathies associated with Babesia bovis particularly, not with Babesia bigemina. Then coming to nervous signs, again, nervous signs are basically seen in case of Babesia bovis, but I have seen a couple of references where nervous signs are also associated with the Babesia bigemina infection. So what is the pathophysiology? Why nervous signs are expressed by these animals, particularly Babesia bovis? As you all know that in the brain, the capillaries are extra small or very small, and the rate of blood flow is very slow. And what happens in such cases, the infected RBCs, they cling on to each other and they cling on to the endothelium of these capillaries, and as a result of which there are emboli, there are thrombus formations, and it may lead to infarcts. The exact reason for clinging of the RBCs to one another and to the endothelium is not exactly known, but it is considered that there is a change in the surface charge of these RBCs, and that is how the other RBCs are attracted, and they also attach to endothelium. So that is the pathophysiology with babesiosis. Hematological profile, if you see, that may add to the diagnosis, feed your diagnosis. In case of trypanosomosis, there is hypoglycemia and secondary ketosis. In case of thalaeriosis, there is lymphocytosis to begin with, and then followed by lymphocytopenia. In buffaloes, you will also see Koch blue bodies in the cytoplasm of the lymphocytes. As you all know, lymphocytes are agranulocytes, so the cytoplasm is very clear. So when you see some spots or granules in the cytoplasm with all the symptoms of thalaeriosis, you can identify it as Koch blue bodies and a case of buffet and case of bubeline thalaeriosis. In case of babesiosis, there is coffee color urine or dark color urine, hemoglobin urea. There is a persistent hemolytic anemia. Even if you give hematinics and B complex iron, you will find the anemia is persistent there, and it is a normochromic, normocytic type of anemia, and 80 or 90% of the cases exhibit regenerative anemia. So there is a response from the bone marrow, and the reticulocyte count is high in such cases. Coming to the necropsy findings in case of trypanosoma, as I've said in the beginning, that in case of cattle and buffaloes, invariably these cases begin as a subclinical cases, then they turn to chronic cases, and then because of the stress, maybe parturition, lactation stress, severe symptoms are exhibited, and even the animals may die. So the animals are debilitated, there is a wasting, and you will find gelatinization of the cardiac muscles. There is a severe anemia, so you can even appreciate the petechial hemorrhages on the serous surfaces of the internal organs, particularly liver and kidneys. In case of thalaeriosis, you will see punched out ulcers on the abomasal mucosa, and it is considered as pathognomonic lesion of thalaeriosis. In all cases of thalaeriosis, the ulcers may not be seen, but when you find the ulcers, it is considered as the pathognomonic lesions. In addition to that, you will also see swelling of lymph nodes. In case of babesiosis, you will see that all the mucous membranes are pale, even the serosal surfaces of the internal organs are pale, and you may see petechial hemorrhages on that. But the important finding you can see here that if you cut upon the urinary bladder, the color of the urine is very dark, or it is a coffee color, and then you can diagnose on the basis of postmortem lesion as a case of babesiosis. So these are the postmortem lesions. Then coming to laboratory diagnosis. When I was actually preparing this particular presentation, because, you know, as I've already confessed that my practical experience with these animals, large animals, is very limited. So I called some of my friends, my colleagues, even my students, and asked them that which particular aspects one will explain in rather more detail. And I was rather surprised to have equivocal answers from all of them that I should be talking on a laboratory diagnosis. In fact, I was very happy because I am of the opinion that even though, yes, your clinical experience is great, you are identifying these cases and the clinical symptoms, but you should process the blood samples in the laboratory, at least from the few representative cases. So for next 5 to 10 minutes, I'll be talking on laboratory diagnosis, and it's like a UG lecture, you know, there's nothing. If you follow these steps scrupulously, you know, the diagnosis is, you cannot miss the organisms in the blood smear. As you all know, that the method of diagnosis is by blood smear examination from the peripheral blood circulation. So you should collect the blood sample at the height of temperature or when the symptoms are expressed by the animals from the peripheral circulation, ideally from the ear flap or ear pinna, from the region or from the area which does not have a major blood vessels. I have seen some of the veterinarians collecting blood sample from the ear vein. That is an error. You should collect the blood sample from the area which does not have a major blood vessel. So clip off the hair, then clean the area with the spirit, allow it to evaporate, and then prick the area with a sterilized needle so that the blood oozes out. You discard the first drop of blood because it contains more of a plasma and less number of cells. And then the second drop of blood is taken for blood smear preparation if you are doing it on the spot. I would recommend that you should collect the blood samples from the peripheral circulation, say around 0.3 ml or 0.5 ml, more than enough, you know, in the anticoagulant vial, and work in the laboratory for better results. So how to prepare a blood smear? Okay, you need clean glass slides. The glass slides should be clean. So you just clean the glass slides in the field conditions. I know you have water, then clean it with ordinary water, wipe it with the cotton or a tissue paper is available everywhere. So wipe it with a tissue paper. And then the clean slides must be held at their edges. Don't touch the surface. And then you require 2 slides. One is a spreader slide for preparing the smear, and the second slide is a slide on which the blood smear is prepared. So what you should do first, that in the spreader slide at one end, chip off the corners of these spreader slide, okay, with the help of a glass pencil or with the help of a bone cutter, about 1 to 2 millimeter on either side, you just chip off. Okay, I will tell you why this step is necessary later on at the end of the process. So on the spreader, on the glass slide, you take a small drop of blood about a pinhead side on one side of the slide on which the blood smear is to be prepared, and then keep the spreader slide in the third diagram. You can see, you know, I'm not using this arrow or this laptop because I'm afraid that, you know, by mistake I will shift the slide. Okay, so in the third picture on the right hand corner, you will see that the spreader slide is to be placed just in front of the blood drop in such a way that the angle of 20 to 30 degrees is formed between the 2 slides, and then you move the slide back towards the blood drop till it touches the blood drop. As you can see here in the fourth picture, as soon as it touches the blood drop, the blood flows along the line of contact within 2 to 3 seconds. And then with one swift action, you push the spreader slide to the farther end so that the blood is dragged behind the spreader slide in the form of a thin film. And then the film is stained with available staining reagent, and then it is to be examined under the low and high and oil immersion objectives of compound microscope. In the last picture, you will see stained blood smear, and there you can appreciate that the margins of the blood film are well within the edges of the slide on which the blood film is prepared. So there should be at least a difference of 1 to 2 millimeter between the margins of the blood smear and the edges of the glass slide. This is very important because the parasites, even intercellular parasites like trypanosomes and parasitized cells, RBCs and WBCs, being lighter in weight, they flow with the capillary action to the periphery very quickly. So most of the parasitized cells are present at the margins of the blood smear, and these are the areas one should search for the presence of parasites. And if you don't chip off these corner pieces, then the margins of the blood smear overlap the edges of the glass slide, and then identification becomes difficult. So this is a practical hint, and you can have this slide, once you chip off the margin, the same slide can be used for preparation of blood smear 20, 30, 40, 50. So every time you don't have to do this. Okay. Now, as I was saying that you should collect the blood sample and work in the laboratory for the better diagnosis, because in the laboratory you can fill the capillary glass tubes with the blood. 0.1 or 0.2 ml are sufficient for that, and allow it to stand for say 30 minutes, during which the cellular components settle down and the plasma remains at the top. And initially, the lowermost portion is the RBCs, then there are immature RBCs, as you can see on your screen, then there are leukocytes, then platelets. So this the middle portion where there are leukocyte, platelets, and where the plasma begins, that is a Buffy coat layer. And that layer should be used for preparation of the blood smear or the Buffy coat smear, so that the sensitivity of the technique can be improved many folds. So you can break the capillary tube at this particular level and tap it on the glass slide to have 1 or 2 drops on the glass slide, and then prepare the blood smear, prepare the Buffy coat smear in the method as I have already explained on the previous slide. Then staining is also very important, okay, because ultimately these are microscopic creatures, they are intracellular, so it is strenuous for even eyes also. So your staining should be very good. Now there are 3 different types of stains available, like a field stain, which is very, very user-friendly, very quick to perform, then Leishman stain and Giemsa stain. Now field stain has 2 solutions, 2 reagents, reagent A and reagent B. In reagent A there is methylene blue, in reagent B there is eosin. So once you prepare the blood smear, it is absolutely air dry, then you fix the smear by dipping it in rectified spirit or in alcohol for 2 to 3 minutes, and then take it out. And then dip it in solution B, that is eosin, 8 to 10 times. The frequency should be such that the entire process will be completed in say 30 to 40 seconds. Like what we do, dip chai, something like that. You dip it 8 to 10 times in say 30 to 40 seconds. And then you dip it in distilled water for 2 to 3 times to remove the excess of eosin. And then you dip it 2 to 3 times in solution A, that is methylene blue, and then wash it, dip it again in the water, or then you can directly wash under running water. Now this is very important step. You should wash the smear at least for 2 minutes under running water, so that all the artifacts and the stain particles are eliminated from the blood smear, and then the examination or investigation becomes easier. After that, keep the slides upright to drain and dry, and then after drying the slides absolutely, you can use to examine under the microscope, particularly high power objective and oil immersion. If you use the wet slide for observation, particularly under oil immersion, then the droplets are formed. and then examination becomes difficult. In case of Leishman stain, which is an alcoholic stain, fixation is not required. You just keep the slide flat on the staining rack with the smear side on the top, and then flood the smear with Leishman stain for 1 to 2 minutes. Add a double quantity of distilled water or buffer solution, wait for 8 to 10 minutes, and then the rest of the procedure is same. In case of Giemsa, which is an aqueous stain, so the fixation is required. If the stain is alcoholic, fixation is not required. If it is aqueous stain, then fixation is required. So Giemsa, fixation is required, and you have to fix it in methanol, and then after fixation, dip it in diluted Giemsa for 30 minutes, and rest of the procedure is same. So most important steps here are the washing and drying of the slides. So what you observe after taking so much of efforts in the laboratory, then you can see these organisms. Trypanosoma, you cannot miss it because these trypanosomes are quite evident and you can't miss it. They are free in plasma or they are intercellular. In the first picture on the left side, you will see a classical trypanosome with a dark violet color nucleus in the center, and flagellum also you can see very clearly. In the second picture, you will see there are two nuclei. So this stage is in a dividing stage, binary fission. And in the third slide, you will see this is a blood smear which is teeming with trypanosomes. Then in case of thalaeriosis, you will see in the blood smear in the RBCs, the pyriform organisms which are very, very small, 1 to 2 microns in length or in diameter. Sometimes, it may be mistaken for even anaplasma because they are very small. Anaplasma 0.5 to 1 micron in diameter. So such cases are seen. Now, in case of thalaeriosis, particularly during the early phase of infection, there is one more diagnostic procedure which is very handy and which can be performed under field condition, and that is by collecting fine needle aspirate from the lymph node. What you can do that if the lymph node is swollen, then you can hold the lymph node in between your index finger and thumb, and then pierce the area with a fine needle. For example, in cattle, 18 gauge or even 20 gauge is the fine needle, and prick it through the skin into the lymph node, and then with the syringe push about 0.3 to 0.5 ml of normal saline, sterilized saline, or even the water for injection can be used for this purpose, and then push it in the lymph node, and with your thumb and index finger give little massage for say about a minute or two, and then withdraw the fluid in the syringe again and put it on the glass slide and prepare the smear. You will see Koch blue bodies, large number of lymphocytes having those granules in the cytoplasm, and these are nothing but the Koch blue bodies. In the third picture, you will see the longitudinal section of a lymph node which is swollen, and at the periphery, cortical region, you will find the petechial hemorrhages, which are very, very evident. Then in the lungs, you will see that there is emphysema. Let me try to show you this. This is the area where there is emphysema. You can see, air trapped in the lung tissues. So that is emphysema. So these are the postmortem lesions and the laboratory findings. In case of babesiosis, you will find the classical pyroplasms in the RBCs, which quite big as a Babesia bigemina large pyroplasm. They make an angle with each other. Their narrow ends are very close to each other, angle of around 30 to 40 degrees in between them, and such pyroplasms can be seen. And there is a pale mucous membrane. As you can see here in the second picture, there is absolutely paper white conjunctiva, you can see there, and there is a severe anemia. In the third picture, you will see the incision taken on the urinary bladder, and you can see dark colored liquid or a dark color inside, and that is a coffee colored urine inside the bladder. So that is how you can identify these cases under field conditions. Now I have included one more plate here because Babesia, they show pleomorphism. You may not see always that classical pairs of pyriform organisms. sometimes you will see one organism, sometimes you will also see organisms extracellularly. Sometimes, you have to consider a three-dimensional image in your mind. For example, in this case, in this particular slide, when you are seeing from the front angle, the organisms look like this. But if this particular RBC is viewed from the top, you will see organisms like this, or organisms which are lying in straight line. So one should be aware of all these different orientations in order to have a reliable diagnosis. So the other 2-3 pictures, this is a chart, a diagrammatic representation showing different orientations seen in case of babesiosis. Then control of these hemoprotozoan infections, that is also a job of a field veterinarian. In fact, that is why, I suppose the designation of our field veterinarians is livestock development officer. So control is very much, a part of their duty or their job. And control of vector-borne diseases has many angles. Okay, one should have a epidemiological data. I have already spoken about epidemiological data, why it is necessary. I will not be talking much again on that. Then sensitive diagnosis, I have already elaborated adequately on that particular point. Then judicious treatment, I'll be talking on that. Control of vector itself is a new chapter, and there are many angles, many perspectives as far as the vectors control is concerned. And then I will be talking on immunoprophylaxis. So in my presentation now, these two topics are remaining, that is the treatment and immunoprophylaxis. Now coming to treatment of SARA, of course, I am not going to tell you something new. It is all, the medicines which are being used for last so many years or decades. One thing I would like to tell you, the field veterinarians, one of my PhD students, of course, he did not complete PhD under my supervision, but he did work on drug resistance by Trypanosoma evans to commonly use anti-trypanocidal drugs like antracite prosalt and diamynazine. I don't know whether Suramin is now available or not, but antracite prosalt and diamynazine, and to the best of my knowledge, he did not find any resistance. So all these medicines which are being used for last so many years, fortunately there is no resistance against these compounds. So these compounds are even efficacious today. Antracite prosalt is a prophylactic as well as curative, or I should say curative as well as prophylactic. So during the fly season, this drug can be used, and the prophylactic period is as long as say 60 to 90 days. Suramin, as I've said, I don't know whether it is available or not, but during the initial phase of my practice, this drug was available under the trade name Gilpol, and those tabela owners or the mehtas, they used to use this particular product quite frequently, and their belief was that साहब इसको अगर हमने दे दिया तो भैंस का दूध बढ़ता है. Yes, true, because trypanosomes are eliminated and then the milk yield improves. Diamynazine, I don't recommend diamynazine for the treatment of trypanosomosis because it is not the drug of choice. It is a drug of choice for African trypanosomosis, but not the Indian trypanosomosis caused by Trypanosoma evans. And now you have a new product available, isometamedium chloride, and that can be given at the rate of 0.5 milligram per kg as an intramuscular injection for curative efficacy, while the dose is doubled for prophylactic efficacy. I couldn't find the adequate references about isometamedium chloride treatment or a prophylactic efficacy against Trypanosoma evans. There are quite a few references about African trypanosomosis, which state that the protection period is as long as 8 to 12 weeks. Now, one more point I would like to mention here, that if the total volume of the drug to be injected intramuscularly is more than 10 ml, then it is always advisable to divide into two doses and given at two different sites. Then filariasis, buparvocone is the drug of choice. It is active against the sizeontal stages as well as the RBC stages, and it is very, very efficacious. And the same instruction or the same method should be followed, that if the total dose is more than 10 ml, it should be divided at 2 different sites. Oxytetracycline can also be used at a high dose at 10 milligram per kg body weight and to be given intravenously once a day for 5 consecutive days. It has an efficacy against sizeontal stages, but it doesn't have the efficacy against the pyroplasmic stages which are present in the RBCs. There is one factor, pharmacology. Pharmacology is my in-law department, so I can, tell you that this oxytetracycline may not enter into the RBCs. That is called as a partitioning of the drug across the membrane into the cell. That may not be happening, and that is why the drug is not efficacious against the pyroplasm. Halofuginol was recommended once upon a time when it was available in our country as a coccidiostat, but I don't think this is now available in our country. Then babesiosis, the drug which is extensively used is diminazine at the rate of 3.5 to 8 milligram per kg deep intramuscular, and it can be repeated after 3 days if required. Nowadays, you have a ready-to-use formulation available with antipyretic phenazone in it. So, with one injection, both the effects can be, you can have both the effects. Imidocarb, if some of the recent literatures, see, one thing I would like to mention here, being retired about 3 years back, and during this lockdown period, I could not have the access to the full-length papers. On internet, I used to go through the literature, but I used to get only the abstracts. In order to refer the full-length paper, there was like, you have to subscribe for the journals and e-journals and all that. So in some of these references, what I find, they are now recommending imidocarb as a drug of choice for babesiosis. I don't know whether this imidocarb is available for large animals in the field condition, but for small animal, imidocarb is available, and it is to be given at the rate of 1 milligram. For small animal, dogs, the dose is much higher, 5 milligram per kg. But for cattle, the dose is lower, 1 milligram per kg body weight to be given subcutaneously, and it can be repeated after 14 days. Because all these anti-protozoal drugs have got a very good protein binding, and that is why, the frequency of administration is less. So imidocarb can be used in some countries. Imidocarb is also used as a prophylactic for treatment for Babesia bigemina. Then for anaplasmosis and ehrlichiosis, oxytetracycline can be used at the rate of 10 to 15 milligram per kg body weight. Some of the other antibiotics have also been recommended in the literature. Even azithromycin and clindamycin have also been recommended in the literature, but I don't know whether those drugs are available for their use in large animals. So that formulations, whether available or not, I have no idea. I think I would like to hear from you people. Then in addition to that, a supplementary therapy is also very important, because most of the time the infection enters into the latent phase or a chronic phase, and then you have to manage with the supportive therapy of different medicines, B complex and iron for boosting of RBC production, then dextrose, particularly in trypanosomosis, because there is hypoglycemia. Then good plane of nutrition should be maintained. And this, the next factor, which is ignored mostly, because during extension camps, when we used to discuss with the field veterinarians, this is usually ignored, that the other causes of blood loss should be eliminated. For example, if there are blood-sucking helminths in the body, those should be eliminated from the body of the animal to avoid the additional blood loss by giving anthelmintics like Haemonchus infection and other trichostrongyl worms. Ticks on the body, they are also voracious bloodsuckers. So the care should be taken to eliminate the ticks from the body, so that the blood loss is avoided, and then the blood saved is blood utilized, and then the positive response will be achieved much quicker. Then corticosteroids. Corticosteroids are recommended for the refractory cases where the anemia is persisting and where the anemia reaches the life-threatening situation. I don't recommend corticosteroid because corticosteroids is basically recommended to suppress the immunological reaction, because as we have seen in most of the cases, the anemia is due to immunological reaction, erythrophagocytosis, and in order to suppress that action, corticosteroids are given. But corticosteroids will make the animal vulnerable to other infections. In fact, the infections or the infection for which the animal is treated may enter into the latent phase. So you have to analyze the blood sample in the laboratory. And if you find that the hemoglobin percentage is less than 5 or 4, then you should go for corticosteroid. If it is more than 5, you should give supportive therapy, eliminate the other causes of blood loss, and then by prolonged supportive therapy, the cases can be recovered. Then immunity, I am not going to talk in details because that is not the point which is very relevant, because vaccines are also not available barring the exception of thalaria. So in case of trypanosoma, the immunity is practically nil. Every time the organisms are injected into the body of the animal, the infection establishes in the body because these trypanosomes, they evade the immune response of the host. Now you can imagine these trypanosomes are free living in plasma, where there are also proteins, antibodies. It is as good as the terrorist sitting in the military camp. But there is no effect on this, or this terrorist is not eliminated. Why? Because these trypanosomes, they frequently change their antigenic type. And by the time antibodies are formed against one particular type of antigenic configuration, the antigenic type has changed from A to B, from B to C. And that is how these trypanosomes keep changing the antigenic types, and that is how they evade the immune response of the host. So practically there is no immunity. As far as thaliariosis, nowadays in some of the recent literature, there is a conflict whether it is a pre-immunity or a solid immunity or a lifelong immunity. I would like to hear from you whether you have seen thalaria cases in one particular animals after a gap of, or repeat cases after a gap of 3 to 5 years. That may answer this particular question, whether it is a pre-immunity or a solid immunity. There are some of the references which state that it is a solid immunity, while the old version is that because the organisms are maintained in the body in low grade, so there is a pre-immunity which the organisms are maintained in the body for few months to few years, and that is how endemicity is reached in a particular area. So I would like to hear from the participants here. Then in case of babesiosis, it has been stated that there is a cell-mediated immune response as well as a humoral immune response, and there is a pre-immunity. Now in babesiosis, there is a reverse age resistance. And if these animals are exposed to Babesia infection during early phase of their life, then that is very helpful for them to enter into the pre-immune status. And then such animals do not suffer, or they suffer less severely as compared to the animals which all of a sudden exposed to the infection during their adulthood. So that is the immune status or immunity in general, in short. As far as immunoprophylaxis or vaccine is concerned, there is no commercial vaccine is available for trypanosomosis, in spite of a number of attempts which are being made by the scientific community. Different proteins from trypanosoma, practically I can tell you around 14 to 15 different molecules have been attempted or tested for developing the vaccine, but there is no commercial success. Same is the story with Babesia. There is no commercial success. I don't see any prospects as far as the vaccine is concerned in next few years pertaining to trypanosomosis and babesiosis. And in thaliariosis, there is a vaccine available, which is a Sysontel vaccine. there are certain hardships to be, followed for this vaccination, that the vaccine should be carried in liquid nitrogen, and the protocol has to be followed. So this vaccine should be given, the first vaccine should be given at the age of 3 months, and then after that, there should not be any other vaccination for at least 8 weeks or for 2 months, and then the boosters, depending upon the endemicity of that particular area, can be given after 3 years. In thaliariosis, there are different strains which have been reported in India. Parbhani strain, then Bhopal strain, Gujarat strain, Hisar strain. There are different strains which vary in pathogenicity. But the different strains are influenced by this particular vaccine. So that is all about the vaccine. Then I would like to sum up my topic. Though it is like a revision for the field veterinarians, I don't know how many points are really useful for you in your clinical practice. I'm anxious to know from the participants. I would like to sum up, my conclusions are, hematoprotozoal diseases are widely prevalent in India. Mostly now they are in subclinical forms, but even in that form, they are associated with economic losses. And even in subclinical form or in latent form, there is always a hanging sword on the head that these latent infections may flare up during the stressful condition, and there may be the clinical episode. Then the clinical entity depends on number of factors: the immune status of the host, breed, age, and then the pathogenicity of the strain, as I've said in case of thaliariosis, then the quantum of inoculation. So all these factors are involved, which may vary from place to place, from case to case. So it is a challenging job for the field experience, for the field veterinarians. And one point I would like to stress here, that you guys are doing wonderful job at the grassroots level, and particularly in the unorganized sector. Now I want you to add one more, feather in your cap, that investigate in the laboratory and keep publishing. For us, like researchers and academicians, we need to have a first-hand information from the field veterinarians. So it will be a good platform for the field veterinarians as well as academicians and researchers to work together. Then vaccine development, we have vaccine against thaliariosis. I don't see, immediate vaccine against trypanosomosis or babesiosis. In fact, if you see some of the foreign references where the concept has changed altogether, the similar concept we are finding for malaria eradication program or malaria vaccine. One vaccine should have efficacy not only against the vector-borne infection, but also against the vector. And those efforts are being made for malaria and mosquitoes. So somewhat similar approach is required for the vector and vector-borne infections in ruminants also. And once again, I appeal to all the field veterinarians that please, whatever, data you have, whatever unusual observations you come across, please present it, publish it, not in the international journal, but the local journal, or compile the data and present it in your annual meetings, so that, there will be documentation of all these, observations, and which will be handy not for even the field veterinarians, it will be handy for researchers and the academicians, so that the communication gap between the field veterinarians and the researchers or academicians can be bridged effectively. So with these words, I would like to wind up my topic. There are a few references. I have basically used the compendiums of national conferences textbooks for preparing this presentation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time on a Sunday afternoon. Thank you very much. Over to you, the organizers, for the next session.
Thank you very much, sir. It was very nice, and lecture, sir, it is a perfect blend of technical as well as a field knowledge. I would like to invite Mr. Karunanidhi sir to have some remark on the presentation. Over to Karunanidhi sir.
Please.
Yeah, sir, thank you very much for the excellent presentation.
My pleasure.
Your excellent academic background as well as your practical knowledge has been explained in this 1.5 hours. I am sure the participant. I am sure the
more than the
participant
time
might.
allotted to me.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
This it's very practical. I am sure more than me, the participant would have enjoyed this program much better than that, because they are more practical and they are the people who are going to treat the animal, seeing the cases. So it's wonderful presentation, and I hand over the session to Dr. Shinde for further question and answer. And my team has already shortlisted the questions.
Okay.
With the person who has asked the question, and also the questions can be typed and presented on the screen, so that doctor will not have any difficulty in answering or reading the question.
Yeah, I will try my best to answer all these questions. I don't claim to have a complete knowledge, but whatever, bookish knowledge I have, I'll try to answer those questions. If not immediately, then at least by referring the literature and then I will approach you by email. Okay, go ahead.
Sure, sir.
Thank you very
Sure,
much,
sir.
I will invite now Dr. Sanjay Latkar to take the question answer session. Over to Dr. Sanjay Latkar.
Thank you very much, sir, for really a knowledgeable and practical presentation. There are more than 100 questions, but due to time constraint, we have selected few questions, and
Okay.
I compiled in a PPT. I will run this PPT, and
Okay.
with the name of the doctor, concerned doctor also.
Okay.
So I will share the screen.
Okay.
So this is a
Okay.
few questions. After
What is
that,
the?
I will
Okay.
change the slide.
Okay. I can answer this logically, though I may not be having data with me to prove or to answer this particular question. What is the effect on live weight gain of animals in hemoprodosome diseases? Now, in case of babesiosis and anaplasmosis, which is reverse age resistance, and these are the diseases of adulthood. But in case of theileriosis, in case of trypanosomosis, definitely there is an adverse impact as well as the live weight impact on the live weight is concerned. In fact, there are quite a few references stating that these animals attain puberty very late. Those which acquire these infections during the early phase of their life, then the puberty is attained very late. So there is an impact on the live weight gain if the infection is acquired during the early phase of their life. Okay. Then which medicine is best helpful for anaplasmosis in field level? Anaplasmosis, my knowledge or whatever information I have, oxytetracycline is effective. The only thing is a dose rate. It is effective at the rate of 15 milligram per kg body weight, and ideally if it is given intravenously as a slow intravenous injection, you can dilute it with dextrose and over a period of 5 days. Now, if this dose is not calculated properly, or if the animals are underdosed, then you will get a transient effect or a clinical recovery for a transient period, and then there are relapses of these cases. So oxytetracycline works very well against anaplasmosis. At least I haven't come across any reference stating resistance of anaplasma marginal against oxytetracycline. Then the next question is, even after treatment, body temperature of cow not coming at 101 degrees Fahrenheit, where the animal starts rumination and take feed. This creates confusion. Please suggest the remedy. A remedy I have already suggested that, see, in your clinical practice, you are diagnosing these cases on a clinical basis. And then you give a treatment, there is a symptomatic relief, and then the animals recover and come back to normalcy. But it is not a guarantee that all the organisms are eliminated from the body of the individual, and the infection, particularly Babesia bigemina, may enter into the latent phase, and after a few weeks or even 1 or 2 months, then you will find the relapse or the similar symptoms again. So if you collect the blood sample to even assess your treatment and make a Buffy-Coat smear, then say for 3 to 4 occasions, then you will come to know about the exact status of the infection, whether the organisms are eliminated from the body or not. And then you can assess the effectiveness of your therapy. In the literature, immunodiagnostic methods, even molecular methods are suggested, but I think that will take too long for, to reach the field conditions. Then there is one more question: can Theileria annulata parasites be transmitted by vectors other than hiloma? There are few references, because that is a difference between Theileria annulata and Theileria parva. In Theileria parva, once the organisms enter into the RBCs, then these organisms do not multiply. In case of Theileria parva, but Theileria annulata, the organisms can multiply. I have seen couple of references, but I don't know whether this is a well-established fact or not. Of course, you can on the first plate of my presentation there is my email ID. We can have conversation on email. Let me go through the literature to find out whether this kind of transmission takes place or not, or whether the needle passage can occur in case of theileriosis. Okay, next plate, Dr. Latkar. Why prevalence of protozoal disease is high in Uttarakhand? I have no answer for this. Why? Maybe you guys are one step ahead. Maybe you are doing diagnostic procedures on a regular basis, because as I've said, these are the age-old infections. Right from 1960s, the same infections are continuing in India, and now the pathogenicity has reduced to some extent nowadays as compared to the early days, and many of these infections are subclinical, and you need sensitive techniques for identification of subclinical infections, and or you should do the blood smear examinations more frequently to encounter such cases. So I really don't know the answer for this, what is so special about Uttarakhand. Maybe it also depends on how frequently diagnostic approaches are followed. The same is the situation with COVID also. Now people are saying the COVID cases or the reports are less because your diagnostic protocols are less. If you increase the numbers, the cases may be more. Something like that may be happening. I really don't know. Next is, how can we confirm theileriosis without blood examination? As in field condition, blood examination is not available. In the first place, I don't agree in the field condition, blood examination is not available. At every dispensary, there is a microscope, and you don't need sophisticated techniques, okay, or sophisticated equipments. What you need is a decent microscope, glasswares, glass slides, and a staining reagents. So I don't consider that these are not available. In fact, you should follow this. I know initially for first few blood smears, you will be confused. You may feel that, no, I am not good enough to identify these organisms. But if you continue, then you will start enjoying this. And then I am pretty sure that once you start enjoying this laboratory diagnosis, you will examine the blood sample of all the suspected cases. Next is by Dipesh Sharma. Sir, how cerebral babesiosis is diagnosed, and it also includes the nervous signs or not? Yes, cerebral babesiosis is associated with Babesia bovis. Uh, See, the days of identification up to species level or a strain level on the basis of morphology has gone or have gone, because Babesia bovis is a small pyroplasm. You can definitely distinguish from Babesia bigemina, but you will also appreciate that you need an experienced eye. And that is why I am appealing again and again to all my friends, to start following these practices in the field conditions. So Babesia bovis is not that ubiquitously distributed in India, in all parts of India. And Babesia bigemina cases are not associated with the nervous sign. So cerebral babesiosis, to the best of my knowledge, is associated with Babesia bovis. And I think pathophysiology I have already explained. And nervous signs could be, like cerebral infarcts or a stroke kind of, symptoms can be seen in case of these animals. Then next question, I can't read, sir. Recently, one outbreak in Gujarat district, red urine. I can't see the full screen. Dr. Latkar, if you can read it for me, I'll be able to answer. Dr. Latkar?
Yes, sir. I'm reading, sir.
The last line I cannot read.
Yes. Dr. Rakesh Bhojne have asked this question. Sir, recently one outbreak in Gujarat district, red urine. Local veterinarian can say that not a babesiosis. What is possible for red urine?
Okay, there is one more condition called as periparturient hemoglobin urea, which is seen after the calving or after the parturition. Now, the exact reason for this is not known. Now, many people consider hypophosphatemia is the main reason for periparturient hemoglobin urea. There are some references that by consuming certain legumes or certain plants, there is hemoglobin urea. So when it is observed as an outbreak, that possibility is more. But I will have to read in detail about your question, and maybe, through email, I'll revert to you. Next plate for questions, Dr. Latkar. Okay, after recovery by thalariosis, many cattle suffer with clinical mastitis. Why? I don't have a pinpoint answer why there is a clinical mastitis. Maybe, as I've said, the thalariosis in the earlier part, the main pathophysiology is a vesiculitis, and in the mammary glands, maybe the mammary veins are affected by that, or maybe there is an immunosuppression, and clinical mastitis is secondary to immunosuppression. One has to investigate. Then Aniruddha Singh, what is the best site for blood collection in thalariosis diagnosis? The best site for detecting pyroplasm in the RBCs is the ear pinna or any peripheral blood circulation at the height of temperature, and Buffy coat smear. And then for detection of Koch blue bodies, you can collect the lymph node aspirate. The lymph node which is superficial and showing lesions or enlargement, you can select that. In babesiosis nowadays, diaminosin acetate also not effective, sir. Any resistance develop, kindly give your expert view. In the limited access what I have to the recent literature, I haven't come across the resistance to diaminosin. See, again, the same reason. When the babesiosis cases enter into the latent phase, their rate of multiplication is extremely slow. And in diaminosin therapy, the organisms are exposed to diaminosin when they come out of the RBCs, because the partitioning of diaminosin across the cell membrane into the RBC is very less. And when organisms come out of the RBCs for propagation and to infect new RBC, then they are exposed to diaminosin. So maybe, you are confronting some situation like this, but I haven't come across any references of dimenazine resistance. I will search again and get back to you on email. But as I've said during my presentation, that imidocarb has been suggested by many researchers for the treatment of Babesia bigemina infection at the rate of 1 milligram per kg subcutaneously, along with atropine sulfate injection. Then what is the confirmatory stage in thalidomide, KBB or pyroplasmosis? Now, if you, in the active phase of infection, pyroplasmosis or the level of parasitemia in the blood may be very low to the detectable level, but in the early phase of infection, enlargement of lymph node is indicative, suggestive, and if you collect the lymph node aspirate, then Koch blue bodies can be identified very easily. I would say identification of Koch blue bodies is much easier than the identification of the pyroplasm in the RBCs. Yeah, I think these questions are over. Next, plate.
Done.
Sir, thank you very much. Due to time constant, we have restricted questions, and we will definitely give their answer in personal mode. Now I hand it over to Dr. Santosh Shinde, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanjay, for question and answer session. Thank you, sir. Only 2 points I wanted to add during this session, sir. We got a product of isometamedium chloride, hydrochloride, that is in the under brand name of Serral, and we conducted trial in Belgacia Veterinary College, that is West Bengal University, and in that college we studied the efficacy of isometamedium chloride in Trypanosoma evansi, and it is very effective, sir.
No, I was talking about the prophylactic duration.
Duration, okay, sir. Okay.
Duration, and where this was published, because I couldn't find, even I was asking Dr. Latkar, give me references about Trypanosoma evansi. Okay, but thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Okay, sir. Now the most important session, we can say, vote of thanks session. Sir, very warm and good evening to one and all, and Honorable Ghatne, sir. I would like, then it is my privilege, sir, to propose vote of thanks speech and acknowledge the contribution of those who really work hard to make this webinar successful. On the behalf of all the participants, Alembic Pharmaceutical Limited, myself, Dr. Santosh Shinde, express my sincere gratitude to Honorable Ghatne, sir, for such an informative and applied presentation of management of pneumocontrol diseases in large animals. So it was a perfect blend, I can say, and your presentation will definitely help the field veterinarian in their day-to-day practice, sir. And they will start now with your appeal. They will definitely start noting the cases and publishing the cases and the findings. That will help the researcher as well as our academicians. In future also, sir, we would like to take such a benefit of such an interesting and useful session, so that will upgrade our knowledge and we can serve the society. Last but not least, I would like to thank you all the participating veterinarian, those who are student, faculty, as well as field veterinarian, as well as Alembic field staff, then Mr. P. Karunanidhi, Senior Vice President, Sales and Marketing, for his continuous guidance and support, Mr. R.K. Sharma, AGM Sales of Alembic Pharmaceuticals, and my entire PMT team for making this webinar successful. Thank you very much, Honorable Ghatne, sir, and practicing veterinarian. Thank you, sir.